Great to hear.
Okay,
People in the room hear me?
yeah,
Okay.
we do.
All right, redo. Let's take this from the top. 3, 2, 1. My name is Will Hedberg. I am Associate Professor of Japanese at Silk and the Associate Director for the Asia Center. And I want to welcome everyone to the second installment of our ongoing lecture series, now in its second year, Global Asia and a Multipolar World, which is a series that invites prominent speakers from an array of disciplines in the humanities, arts, and social sciences to speak about interregional connections across Asia, broadly speaking, flows of texts, people, goods, ideas, and languages. We're delighted and honored to welcome today's speaker, Professor Christopher Lundry, who is a professor investigator at the Centro de Estudios de Asia y Africa at Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City. Dr. Lundry probably needs no introduction, not only because of his extensive publication record and prominence as a scholar of Southeast Asian politics, but also because he is a returning hero here at ASU, having completed his PhD in political science at ASU and having been a leader here at the Asia Center. So it's a pleasure to welcome Chris back to the center. As I said, Professor Lundry is a specialist of Southeast Asian politics, and in particular, Eastern Indonesia and Timor-Leste. His many specialties include revolution and separatism, post-conflict reconciliation, and the colonial history of Southeast Asia. He has published extensively on these topics in prestigious venues, including American Behavioral Sciences, Contemporary Islam, Situations and Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, among many, many others. And he has co-authored 2 books, Narrative Landmines, Rumors, Islamist Extremism, and the Struggle for Strategic Influence, which was published by Rutgers University Press in 2012, and Confronting Leviathan, Contested Sovereignty in Eastern Indonesia, which I believe is coming out very soon, right?
In Spanish, yes.
Fantastic, wonderful. So again, thank you very much. We're delighted to have Professor Lundry with us, and let's give him a big hand.
Thank you, Will. It's very nice to be back, and I appreciate the welcome. As Will mentioned, I did my doctorate here, was here for a number of years afterwards as well. I want to thank the center, especially John and Liana and everybody else for helping organize this. It's great to be back. I want to start by saying that as a little bit of background, my work is in political science, although sort of in a vague way, and I'm not sort of a certified expert in race and ethnicity, but rather I come from a human rights perspective, having worked on revolutionary movements and separatism in Eastern Indonesia specifically, as well as sort of Java and elsewhere in Indonesia. I plan to talk for about 40 minutes and hopefully open to questions afterwards. And I want to acknowledge the fact that this is a topic that most people aren't particularly familiar with, especially Papua in the Indonesian and Asian context. I wrote a chapter for this book, recently published by Asian Studies, about sort of race in Asian studies. And even the editors kept referring to it as Papua New Guinea, which is the eastern half of the island, not Indonesian West Papua. So to be clear, I'm talking about Indonesian West Papua. I'll show you a map in 1 or 2 slides. So inspired by the Black Lives Movement in the United States, the Papuan Lives Movement emerged in the summer of 2020, around 1 year after racist incidents against West Papuans sparked protest and violence in East Java that spread elsewhere in Indonesia, including to West Papua. This presentation will contextualize the colonial and post-colonial history of this region through the lens of race in order to understand the emergence of Papuan Lives Matter. Initially described by European explorers as Black, West Papuans and Melanesians more broadly came to embrace this designation of Blackness, partly in solidarity with African Americans, the African diaspora, and Africans in general. Papuan Lives Matter is an extension of this solidarity arising within the specific context of racism and discrimination in Indonesia. This, again, is something that a lot of people don't talk about, especially, unfortunately, Indonesians. West Papuans share many of the same grievances as do African Americans through BLM. a history of slavery that continues to influence their treatment, institutional and personal racism, disenfranchisement, structural conditions that keep them poorer than their fellow citizens, a history of violence at the hands of police, military, and security institutions that is often committed with impunity. The situation of West Papuans is complicated by their problematic incorporation into Indonesia in 1969, including the disenfranchisement of more than 99% of the population and the presence of separatist sentiment among a large portion of the population that desires independence from Indonesia. While the study of racism in the West has a long history, studies of racism in Asia are much rarer. Furthermore, as Indonesian anthropologist Veronica Kusumariati notes, the place of Black Melanesians in Asian studies is ambiguous, as they are not considered to be proper Asians. It's my hope that this brief article adds to these bodies of work. It should also be noted that many West Papuans embrace their Blackness as a given in their work, and more of their voices would be a welcome addition to Asian studies. First, let's get an idea of where we're talking about, and perhaps from two different perspectives. The first slide here is a map of Indonesia. We have the well-known islands, Java, Sumatra, Kalimantan, right? But we can think about what's missing, right? The northern half of Borneo is missing because it's Malaysian, Sarawak, and Sabah, as well as Brunei. The eastern half of Timor is missing, right? Because we now have independent Timor-Leste after 24 years of brutal Indonesian occupation. To the far east of the map, we see half of the island of New Guinea, severed down the middle in almost a straight line. But of course, the far east of the island is just completely missing from the map. The island was given its name by Spanish explorers in the 16th century, who decided that the inhabitants resembled African Guineans. This is not, of course, the only example of Europeans naming indigenous people based on their flawed perceptions. Just ask the Indians of North America. On the east side is independent and sovereign Papua New Guinea. On the west side is Indonesian West Papua. It was formerly one province, renamed Irian Jaya, but was renamed Papua in 1999, then split into two in 2003 and renamed Papua and West Papua provinces. The split was not popular with West Papuans and ruled unconstitutional by a court, but the court decided it was already done and we'll just have to live with it. Indonesia has recently created 5 provinces out of the region, which is also vastly unpopular with West Papuans. I will use West Papua in this talk to refer to the entire region. I'm not going to distinguish between provinces within Indonesia, as West Papuans refer to it as one region as well. The missing areas in this map allow us to imagine a sort of unified Indonesia. This is what we have. This is our country. But here's another view, one that shows Melanesia, Micronesia, and some of Polynesia, parts of which are also referred to as the Pacific Islands or the Asia Pacific Islands. Note how West Papua in these maps in this map, especially the one on the left, is situated within the Melanesian sphere, below Micronesia and to the west of Polynesia, linking it to others that have been deemed racially similar. The other island groups are named using Greek to describe them physically. Polynesia, many islands. Micronesia, small islands. Melanesia is named after the perceived skin color of its inhabitants, melas being black in Greek. A descriptor of the inhabitants, despite their similarities to other inhabitants or to the inhabitants of other islands. It also reflects the ideas of Europeans of Melanesians as inferior to even other Polynesians or Micronesians. Other maps have included other Indonesian islands as part of Melanesia, including the Moluccas, previously known as the Spice Islands, which is shown here. Alfred Russel Wallace noted the division of flora and fauna and placed a line between Bali and Lombok in Indonesia, but he also argued for a racial line further east that included Sumba, Flores, and Timor, along with the Melanesians. Indonesia has tried to promote Ambon as Melanesian as a way to sort of say, look, we have a bigger Melanesian population. It's not just West Papuans, But this has also been rejected by West Papuans who don't see much similarity with Moluccans. It also has to do with the history of Moluccans coming to West Papua and raiding for slaves. So now we have a good idea where we talk about. Let's proceed. Prior to European contact in the 16th century, parts of West Papua were a source of slaves to the nearby sultanates of Tidore and Ternate in the northern Moluccas, but most Papuans had little contact with outsiders. As Europeans encroached, the Dutch asserted themselves, and West Papua eventually became part of the Dutch East Indies. Dutch sovereignty, however, was tenuous, and other Europeans came to West Papua frequently to trade, raid for slaves, etc. Slavery was banned in the Dutch East Indies in 1863, but remained in practice until the 20th century in West Papua and peripheral regions of the Dutch East Indies. And in fact, one can find slavery to a degree in some parts of Indonesia today, in the island of Sumba, for example, with the caste system. After the American Civil War, slave traders from the United States engaged in slave trading on behalf of Australian farmers, capturing slaves in a process called blackbirding. The border with the eastern half of the island, now Papua New Guinea, was formalized in 1884. The colonial administrative presence was light, and it was mostly missionaries who traveled to the interior of West Papua. Beginning in the 1930s, the Dutch envisioned West Papua as a place for Eurasians or Indos, children of mixed Dutch and Indonesian heritage. Their position had become difficult in the Dutch East Indies as education of natives had proceeded, and they had begun taking administrative posts that were generally held prior by these Indos or people of mixed ethnicity. Indonesian-born Dutch fascists also envisioned West Papua as a new homeland. Dutch attempts at transmigration and establishing farms mostly ended in failure, and the Japanese invasion during World War II ended this experiment. The Japanese occupation was brief, and the Allies fought and retook the territory with the help of Papuans who killed or captured Japanese enthusiastically because the Japanese treated them even more harshly. And of course, rewards were offered. During the war, Papuans saw African-American soldiers working alongside whites. The first time they'd seen people with dark skin and hair like theirs in such positions, and it helped expose the lie of white supremacy, a justification for European colonialism that the Dutch had promoted. Of course, the segregated American service members were far from egalitarian and remain so to this day, but it inspired Papuans nonetheless. In the series of talks between the Dutch and Indonesians during the revolution from 1945 to 1949, a Papuan was present in an official capacity only at the Molino Conference in 1947. Frans Kaisiepo, a Dutch-educated elite, originally favored the Dutch position, that is, allowing the Dutch to hold on to West Papua, but then converted to the Indonesian position and was rewarded by being named governor of the province in 1964. He was not popular with West Papuans. In subsequent conferences until independence in 1949, West Papuans were completely sidelined and were not involved in any of the talks in an official capacity. The Dutch and Indonesians argued that because of the low overall levels of education and development, Papuans were unable to contribute meaningfully to the conversation on independence and to their own future. Papuans have argued that Indonesia in 1949 shared these same attributes of low levels of education following centuries of Dutch colonialism, and that there existed a similar stratum in West Papua of educated elites, which is true. The fate of West Papua was to be settled in 1951, but it was not. Indonesia's President Sukarno labeled West Papua a colonial sword over the neck of Indonesia, and the issue contributed to the nationalization of Dutch assets. Dutch political scientist Arjen Liphart described the trauma of decolonization that the Dutch felt over West Papua, losing the last vestige of empire, but they began programs to educate West Papuans and prepare them for self-government. The Dutch created political councils and trained police, bureaucrats, and a civil service, and hoped that 90 to 95% of all civil service positions would be held by Papuans by 1970. Yet, as Indonesia and Holland became increasingly belligerent, the United States came to favor the Indonesian position, mostly to court Sukarno and wean him away from the far left, and Papuans remained left out of discussions about their fate. In 1962, as the civil rights movement was gaining ground in the United States following the freedom rides 1 year earlier, I'll refer to a couple of historical processes in the United States with regard to the civil rights movement. That's how this book chapter sort of came about. West Papuans' fate was handed to Indonesia, albeit nominally under a United Nations transition and with the promise of a plebiscite. But the UN was sidelined and Indonesianization began rapidly. Papuan civil servants were dismissed and replaced. Papuan police were confined to barracks. Political expression that was not explicitly pro-Indonesia was forbidden, and Papuan nationalists were imprisoned, tortured, and murdered. Sukarno withdrew from the UN over confrontation with Malaysia, and he canceled the referendum, arguing that there was no need because Papuans wanted to be Indonesian, a non-Papuan speaking for West Papuans. We'll see this pattern continue throughout West Papuan history. And in fact, we saw during this period, Indonesians writing letters to the United Nations pretending to be West Papuan or claiming to be West Papuan, saying, we don't need a referendum, we're happy to be Indonesian. After Suharto's rise in 1965 and Indonesia's turn to the right and turn to the west, he assented to an act of free choice to be held in 1969. The referendum was a staged, managed sham by all accounts. The UN representatives were made fools and Cold War appeasement won out again. Just 1,022 West Papuans voted out of a population of around 800,000. And they were selected by Indonesia to vote. Those who spoke out against it were intimidated, imprisoned, tortured, or killed with impunity. The sham results were unanimous for integration with Indonesia. Thus, the act of free choice, certainly an act definitely not free, neither an exercise of choice, denied self-determination and possibly independence to West Papuans, but the international community had its referendum and the region's fate was sealed. It should be noted that discussions of race were banned during Suharto's regime, and to discuss race invited a prison term. In 1965, 1 year before the Black Panthers took up arms in self-defense in the United States and created self-help social programs in the face of apathy or hostility from the American state, armed separatism emerged in West Papua, although some Papuans had been pro-Indonesia all along and others were swayed to join the pro-Indonesian side for opportunistic reasons. Many pro-Indonesian Papuans, including the territory's first governor, however, reversed course when they saw how Papuans were being treated and the policies that sent Indonesians to settle West Papua. Nationalist symbols such as the Bintang Kejora or the Morning Star flag were banned, and cultural expressions were curtailed. Papuans have held that cultural differences also support their claims for self-determination. For example, Papuans are predominantly Christian, while Indonesians are predominantly Muslim. As Octavianus Mote and Danielian Rutherford argue, Indonesians were enamored with West Papua's wealth. The world's largest open pit gold mine and second largest copper mine are there, as are gas fields and oil, but they were not enamored with its people. Indonesia's logic, which held that in 1969, Papuans had to choose representatives to vote because they were uneducated, was ignored in the presidential election just 2 years later. Some 379,000 West Papuans voted in the 1971 national elections for Indonesia, yet rather than reflecting the enfranchisement of the Voting Rights Act that happened here in the United States just 6 years prior, this election was also a farce. Every representative elected was from Suharto's political party, Golkar. Subsequent elections were similarly rigged, essentially disenfranchising Papuans. Yet the idea that West Papuans were unable to participate fully in voting persists among some, just as some in the United States are promoting laws specifically designed to disenfranchise African Americans and other minorities, something that Black Lives Matter is fighting. When observers in the Carter Center delegation, who had been sent to monitor the 2004 Indonesian presidential elections, went to include a section in the report that noted, similar to Aceh in northern Sumatra, the overwhelming military presence in West Papua and the intimidation during the election, former US Ambassador to Indonesia, John Monjo, blurted out, "For God's sake, they're naked." His statement raised more than a few eyebrows. I was there. I heard this in first person. West Papuans viewed the reforms associated with Indonesian democratization that began in 1998, as well as the referendum that led to Timor-Leste's independence, with optimism. The ban on the Bintang Kejora was lifted, and the press was freer for a while. The Papuan Presidium Council was formed, and leaders went to Jakarta, where even those presumed to be pro-Indonesia requested a referendum on independence. Des Eluwe, a traditional chief and former Golkar politician and former Suharto loyalist, emerged as a uniting figure for West Papuans. His assassination at the hands of Indonesian security personnel in November 2001 was viewed by many as a death knell for the resurgent demand for a referendum. Subsequent reforms have mostly been symbolic. Papuans have long identified as Black, and Black movements have long sought to identify with Papuans and Melanesians more generally, including with claims of shared African ancestry and diaspora. Seeing African-American soldiers in World War II stoked this sentiment. In the period between 1949 and 1962, Papuans used this identity to lobby for support for their independence. Papuans' race had been debated for centuries prior to this, including by preeminent thinkers such as Alfred Russel Wallace, who I mentioned earlier. In the colonial era, anthropologists argued over racial distinctions, and often classification came down to impressions of individual surveyors that included assumptions about mental capacity and moral capacity. Classifying Papuans as inferior was a convenient ex post facto justification for their slavery, including the blackbirding that I mentioned, or taking Papuans captive to work in Australia. Despite being left out of the negotiations about their future between 1949 and 1962, Papuan nationalists lobbied for recognition, especially in Africa. Nicholas Joy published Voice of the Negroids in the Pacific to the Negroids throughout the world in April of 1962, after US Attorney General Robert Kennedy visited Jakarta and support for the Dutch position was crumbling. The pamphlet asserts Papuans' separate identity from Indonesia, as well as their right to self-determination. And it notes the presence of elected councils throughout the territory. It appeals for support from other Negroid countries and includes an open letter to Ethiopian leader Haile Selassie, with copies sent to several other African countries. It also includes a copy of a telegraph sent to US President John F. Kennedy, condemning his brother's remarks, calling Papuans backward during his trip to Jakarta. The Papuan position put some post-colonial nations in a bind. Some, in the spirit of the 1955 Bandung Conference, found it hard to criticize the Indonesian position because some Papuan nationalists identified with the Dutch, and the Dutch were still in control of the territory. Some viewed West Papuans as colonial puppets. Although identifying with African and Black movements was an attempt to build solidarity, it also allowed racists to view Papuans as they viewed Black people in general, unable to govern themselves, or even as biblical sons of Ham. Despite common Indonesian portrayals of Papuans as primitive, representative to the UN, Sujarwo, mocked the Dutch, stating, "It may in fact be asked, what kind of racial links have the Dutch with the West Indians? Certainly I look more like a West Indian or Papuan than do my Dutch friends." Portraying himself as Papuan, Major J. Diamara of the Indonesian Defense Council submitted to the United Nations a document addressed to all the peoples of Africa that West Indian is an integral part of Indonesia, another case of an Indonesian speaking for West Papuans. Although some African countries voiced support for West Papua, and Afro-Americans such as W.E.B. Du Bois explicitly included Melanesians when he referred to the Black world, nobody who determined the fate of West Papuans paid much attention. The African-American press reported on events, including a visit by Joy, but the mainstream American press portrayed Papuans as primitive headhunters and cannibals. Despite the act of free choice, West Papuan nationalists raised the Bintang Kejora and declared independence on July 1, 1971. Lobbying for support in Africa and among African Americans, including from the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, West Papuans continue this lobbying, including with the Congressional Black Caucus to this day, and Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, whose former chair, Eni Falio Mavaega, a non-voting member from American Samoa, was a staunch supporter of West Papuan self-determination before his death in 2017. In 2004, the CBC and Falio Mavaega submitted letters to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice asking her to review the Act of Free Choice and quoting Nelson Mandela. In 2010, Falio Mavaega and others urged the Obama administration to prioritize West Papua. And that same year, West Papuans and other activists and academics spoke to the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, and Global Environment about abuses in West Papua. Although one Dutch official portrayed Papuans as sweet or timid, by far the predominant portrayals of Papuans include stupid, dirty, lazy, vicious, hostile, and savage. The land God forsaken. They lived like wild beasts, had no religion, nor kings and superiors, lived from their land, ate pigs, etc. Ligia Giai shows how native informants, predominantly Moluccans, again, these are Moluccans who went to Papua to capture slaves, established the initial stereotypes that became fixed and intertextual. Colonial portrayals of other natives frequently use these stereotypes in part to justify the colonial project and the duty to uplift their subjects. Yet in West Papua, these stereotypes persist. I have heard educated Indonesians say they cannot be racist because Indonesia is a post-colonial society, yet they have referred to Papuans using these stereotypes, justified by the low economic indicators of West Papua. Papuans are referred to as pigs, dogs, monkeys, and other dehumanizing slurs, as noted in the African American press. Papuans' blackness is enough for Indonesian landlords, for example, to reject them as potential renters. Portrayals of Papuans in popular culture reflect these stereotypes. Images of the typical inhabitants of the provinces of Indonesia include West Papuans in koteka, or penis gourds. Although worn by some members of predominantly highland groups, it is not reflective of the traditional garb of the entire region. However, the image works to reinforce these stereotypes in classrooms in Indonesia outside of West Papua. Predominantly Muslim Indonesians view the koteka as immodest and a sign of backwardness, offensive along with Papuans' consumption of pork, both becoming the fodder for jokes. These repeated images turn all Papuans into koteka-wearing savages. In 1971, Indonesia launched Operasi Koteka, Operation Koteka, to get highland Papuans to wear pants and dresses. It failed. The portrayals of Papuans as lazy or stupid can be internalized by West Papuans and lead to low self-esteem. The historical section noted the absence of Papuan voices in determining their future. This voicelessness continues. Following the outbreak of violence in August of 2019, most of the mass media in Indonesia reporting on it and its causes included interviews with non-Papuan sources, officials, the military, and the police. In the context of Papuan Lives Matter, one analysis of Indonesian media conducted by the faculty of Universitas Udayana showed that although images of West Papuans continue to propagate these stereotypes, some media claim that there is no racism towards West Papua because the region is sent special autonomy money, an assertion that makes no sense. One has to look at foreign sources in order to hear Papuan voices on unrest and the Papuan Lives Matter movement. Political representation has proved problematic as well. Sukarno appointed an Ambonese, Zainal Abidin Shah, as governor in exile in 1956, who was succeeded by a Javanese, Pamuji, from 1961 to 1963. Elias Bonet, the first governor of West Irian, was Papuan, but he was removed after 18 months for criticizing Indonesian transmigration. In 1973, Suharto began appointing Sundanese and Javanese military officials as governors. The provinces have Papuan governors now, but outsiders remain in positions of influence, especially in the military. In the latest offering to mollify Papuans, Jakarta named Singgarai Rumagesan, pictured here, as a national hero in 2020. Although he lived in Papua for a time, Rumagesan was Ceramese and Moluccan. As a local king selected by the Dutch, he tried to forcefully convert Christians to Islam, was later imprisoned and exiled by the Dutch, and raised a militia to fight for West Papua's integration with Indonesia. National heroes are meant to epitomize an element of Indonesian history, such as nationalist struggle. In conversations with politically active West Papuans, none knew of Rumagesan, nor that he was declared an Indonesian national hero. He's supposed to be representing West Papua in a national way, and yet Papuans don't even know who this person is. West Papuans, including religious figures, continue to be arrested, tortured, and murdered with impunity by Indonesian military and police personnel. A recent event was eerily similar to the murder of George Floyd, following a disagreement in a food stall between West Papuan Stephen Yarohamang and the proprietor. Two uniformed Air Force officers accosted Yarohamang, wrestled him to the ground, while one put his boot on his head to restrain him, seen here. Like Floyd, the abuse was filmed and disseminated. Though not fatal, the media made the connection to Floyd, and the government apologized and actually dismissed the officers. Given the environment of impunity for abuses in West Papua, one wonders if the case would be known were there not cell phone video. Yet, even if filmed, including death at the hands of police, being filmed does not guarantee justice. In May of 2020, a West Papuan laborer named Marius Petera was beaten by a police officer and captured on video. Yet the coroner's report was suspiciously inconclusive. And the police went on a social media offensive to deny responsibility, labeling the accusation a hoax. It is much easier to find cases such as this than Yarohamang's, given the environment of impunity. Or even cases where the police brag that their violence is legitimate. In Papua, we have a lot of names like George Floyd, stated Elvira Rumbaco, a lecturer at Jayapura's Cendrawasih University. On police abuse, Benny Wenda, the president of the United Liberation Movement for West Papua, remarked, "There's no difference between what happens to African Americans in the US and what happens to West Papuans." Although the situation with West Papuans in Indonesia reflects local political and social contexts, the African American experience continues to be a touchstone for West Papuans. Papuan Lives Matter emerged as a hashtag after the death of George Floyd and nearly a year after the incidents of racist violence directed at West Papuans in Indonesia, starting at a university in East Java in August of 2019. Reacting to a perceived slight, Javanese students, soon joined by security forces as well as irregular militia groups, attacked West Papuans in their dormitories. The violence quickly spread to West Papua and other areas in Indonesia. Images of the protests saturated Indonesian media for weeks and led to violence, arrest, and killings. The hashtag spread, and so did the use of PLM signs at demonstrations. Some West Papuans wrote monkey on themselves to draw attention to the racism, and the use of the Bintang Kejora was also widespread, linking PLM to the broader movement for self-determination. PLM is drawing attention to the structural racism directed at West Papuans in Indonesia, complicated by the situation in West Papua itself. Although there are people who speak on behalf of PLM, it is similar to Black Lives Matter in that it is amorphous. The availability of cell phones enables images of abuse as well as demonstrations to spread rapidly. Asa Aso, an activist and member of the National Committee for West Papua, stated, "We have studied digital movements. We realize that it's not enough to encourage people to join the protests, but also to let people know outside what we are doing. And then they feel involved. When news spreads to the international community, we feel satisfied." In a tacit acknowledgement of the power of new media, the Indonesian government shuts down the internet in West Papua during periods of unrest, employs disinformation campaigns, and uses troll farms to attack West Papuans' messages. Activists skirt the shutdowns through connections at hotels that have their own satellite internet service. Indonesia has been undergoing democratization since 1998 and has made tremendous progress with regard to the freedom of expression, including protest. In West Papua, however, this freedom is suppressed, making Papuans question their place in Indonesia. Are they full citizens? Why then is the government denying them the rights extended to other Indonesians? Why the double standard? Immigration from more densely populated regions of Indonesia to West Papua is also stoking resentment and fears that West Papuans will soon be a minority in their own land. Papuan activists and journalists have also capitalized on the interest stoked by PLM to spread their message, and stories have appeared online and in mainstream media in the United States, Great Britain, Australia, and around the world. Black Lives Matter activists in the United States have displayed Bintang Kejora, the Morning Star flag, in solidarity with West Papua, and have told Papuan activists with BLM, with Papuan Lives Matter placards that they should just use Black Lives Matter, an acknowledgement of the shared Blackness and experience despite the unique context of the West Papuan struggle. In West Papua itself, little has changed despite the campaign. Papuan Lives Matter is known and respected, but as one confidential source told me, people who want to make change are doing so by joining NGOs and organizations that provide relief for West Papuans, including combating what he described as racially motivated lack of distribution of COVID and other medical aid to ethnic Papuans, similar to Black Lives Matter claims in the United States. Among many Indonesians, there's an unwillingness to admit that racism exists. Yet others are more sanguine. Rumkabu noted that although there is resistance from conservative and older Indonesians, younger Indonesians are more willing to discuss race and express solidarity with Papuans. Papuan Lives Matter, she stated, has opened a much needed dialogue about race in Indonesia. This work has explored the similarities of experience and circumstances of West Papuans to African Americans in the United States, including slavery, disenfranchisement, economic exploitation, political marginalization, lack of representation, and institutional and structural racism. It also shows the influence that African Americans have had in West Papua. West Papuans continue to draw inspiration from civil rights and African American movements in the United States, connected by a shared Blackness and a sense of common oppression and painful collective memories. And they continue to lobby for support. Originally denigrated for the color of their skin, West Papuans and Melanesians more broadly have embraced the term Melanesia and are actively working to represent themselves in the context of proud Blackness. The long history of internalized racism due to racist representation means that the challenges for representing Melanesia are therefore not just socioeconomic, but epistemological. The West Papuans' identification with Blackness is one way to challenge old representations, and it demonstrates that the global Black movement has been responded to locally and is shaped by the productions of Black epistemologies. The current situation in West Papua has been shaped by colonial history, Cold War realism, and contemporary Indonesian, regional, and international politics. Traditionally, the political discontent in West Papua has been blamed on factors such as the economy or low levels of development. The shocking racist violence of 2019 and the emergence of PLM, however, may reframe this issue. Rumkabu notes that PLM has highlighted the most fundamental problem of the Papuan conflict, which is racism. whether PLN will be successful in the long term at getting Indonesians to acknowledge the racism that exists there towards Papuans and spur significant and positive changes remains to be seen. But it appears to be sparking conversation, the first step perhaps. Perhaps it will also provoke those of us who study Asia to more deeply interrogate how race and racism fit into our work and acknowledge the marginalized minorities who are frequently overlooked. Thank you.
Thank you very much for incredibly rich and very, very timely talk. Let's open up to Q&A. We have a group in here, and John, if you don't mind kind of monitoring the yes, let's.
I'm Indonesian and I'm specifically Chinese Indonesian, so I know very well that racism, as you said, exists in Indonesia.
Yes.
And I've met several Papuan friends who will most likely agree with everything you just said. My question is this: you discussed Sukarno and Suharto in your presentation. So I'm curious what your opinion is on what the current president, Joko Widodo, about what your opinion is on what he has done with Papua. And if you could have an audience with him, what would you say to him about this issue?
This is a great question. Thank you. So the Chinese population, for those who don't know, is maybe 2 or 3% of Indonesia and has also been victims of racism in Indonesia going back to the Dutch colonial period and continue to be so to this day. It's one of the racial distinctions, ethnic racial distinctions in Indonesia that is discussed. And there is a broader body of work about that in Indonesia, but in other countries of Southeast Asia as well, regarding the sort of the Chinese diaspora communities. Wow, what would I say to Jokowi? That's a great question. As I mentioned in my talk, with the Mekaran, or the division of provinces, the subdivision of provinces into more provinces, this was done under Jokowi, right? And this was a move that alienated West Papuans. They see it as a divide and conquer tactic, right? And what it does is it allows for more military commands, provincial commands, so more military presence and the ability for them to sort of create stronger military infrastructure, right? So Papuans see this as a very clear divide and conquer strategy by Jokowi. So I wanted to say this at some point during my talk, and now's a good enough time to say it. People are beginning to realize that after 60 years in West Papua, West Papuans are discontented and not satisfied with Indonesian sovereignty. And it sort of raises the question of how long does Indonesia need to convince West Papuans to become Indonesians and think of themselves in that way? And is 60 years not enough? In the same way that African Americans in the United States say, why are income levels so low? Why are rates of imprisonment so high? Why are we still a marginalized minority 160 years after the Civil War? And as I mentioned, West Papua has tremendous wealth. And when Freeport was in charge completely of the mine in West Papua, it was the largest foreign contributor to the tax base of Indonesia. So there's a lot of money involved. Right? I think that Indonesians like Jokowi and others have internally acknowledged the fact that West Papuans will never be satisfied with Indonesia. And they just have to say the right things to sort of make people feel good about it. But in reality, give us the gold, give us the copper, and we're going to respond with violence if you aren't satisfied with it. And on the other side, I don't want to speak for West Papuans, but the West Papuans who I know, and my impression is that it's a vast majority of West Papuans, aren't ever going to accept Indonesian sovereignty. And so I've come to sort of accept the position that it's a done deal, it's too late. Indonesia will have to use violence and coercion to remain in West Papua. When the minerals and the oil and everything is gone, maybe Indonesia will say, okay, you can be independent. So I don't have much to say to Jokowi. I really don't. he's not gonna listen to me, and I think that Indonesia, in a lot of ways, has made up its mind about this. Unfortunately, the West Papuans will be the victims. So, I did a lot of work in Timor-Leste with solidarity movements, trying to get a referendum for self-determination. I believe in the same way that West Papua was denied self-determination after it was guaranteed self-determination, and an act of self-determination would be the first step in sort of, creating a better political environment in West Papua. I also have a feeling that I know what the result would be, but that's not my business to say. So, it's the ball is in Indonesia's court, and they've shown an unwillingness to promote policies that better the lives of West Papuans. So
would you say, something that I think you've been alluding to throughout your presentation? Would you say Indonesia is right now an imperialist, or at least acting like one?
yes, absolutely. If we look at work of, who wrote it? Oh, he was here for a while. Michael Hector. Is he still here? I'm not sure. Yeah, he wrote a book called Internal Colonialism, right? And it's based on sort of world system theory perspective of economic exploitation, linked to the dependencia that we were talking coming out of Latin America, that sort of you have these colonial relationships of exploitation that continue into the post-colonial period. Indonesia is very much doing that as well, right? West Papua is the wealthiest region of Indonesia in terms of resources, and yet is among the poorest region in terms of development, in terms of per capita income, et cetera. Right? And we look at people like Ted Robert Gurr, who wrote about relative deprivation as the source for separatism, right? That's West Papua. West Papua should be rich, and West Papuans realize this. It's not as though they don't know that they're living in the wealthiest region of Indonesia, and yet they're suffering from among the highest rates of poverty. So, thank you. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Yes, all right, enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
So my question, I'm just ruminating over your presentation, so I don't know a lot about this area, but I do know a little bit about race and ethnicity. So my question to you is, I'm just curious, what do you think about the limits of thinking about your case study, race in West Papua, in the lens of the civil rights and the BLM movement? I mean, I understand that the activists and the people on the ground are using that as a resource, as a cultural resource to shape their understanding of the movement. But I'm curious, as a academic, what's kind of the pitfalls of thinking about what's happening there and kind of comparing it and thinking it through the lens of a kind of American lens. Like one thing that I think about is just kind of the idea of resistance, right? And so in the US, resistance takes on a more overt form. Other parts of the global South, it's more covert, this idea of weapons of the weak. So that idea, now also thinking about things like, the things that I guess wasn't too clear about was the idea of, yes, I could imagine that in this region of the world, like there were this ideas of race were connected to slavery, but then you talked about kind of the introduction of soldiers in World War II. But I'm just curious, like that is just the nature of this place. It's so dispersed because they're islands, so people are kind of dispersed, and so ideas about race and slavery, how did they pass across the waters, right? In the U.S., when I think about race, it's like very much rooted in the idea of space, the idea of the Black church, where things can kind of ideas can get passed along because the geography is easy for ideas to disseminate. It is about race, but in this area of the world, I'm just curious, like, how are these ideas getting passed on if it's very much dispersed in different parts, populations on different islands? So I was hoping you could just talk about kind of the limits of what you think seeing this movement through the lens of America and the civil rights.
Okay. So, I mean, Indonesia is a very multicultural country, 17,000 islands, 13,000 inhabited, hundreds of languages and sort of social, cultural, ethnic distinctions, et cetera. But Papuans are viewed by most Indonesians as the bottom, as the lowest rung, right? Because of the color of their skin and their physical attributes. And again, this goes back to the Spanish encounters in the 16th century and the naming of the island of Guinea and the fact that they were thought of as black and sort of the most inferior. And also, partly because of their geographic distribution in West Papua, very lightly settled, it facilitated slave raiding, right? And so they sort of occupied this niche, and it's just continued into today. In terms of connections or maybe solidarity with Black Lives Matter in the United States, as far as I can tell, expressions of Blackness among West Papuans have increased. So I think Black Lives Matter helped spur this among West Papuans as a way to frame their struggle, right? Because Black Lives Matter got a lot of press, right? And that's sort of the first step, right? Is making people aware of the fact that you exist and the struggle that you're undergoing, right? And I think the Papuans were able to tie themselves or ride this wave of Black Lives Matter and link themselves to this sort of broader struggle, right? It's, how effective it'll be remains to be seen, right? As I mentioned, some people, especially younger people, seem to be willing to talk about it in Indonesia, but older conservative people aren't. I think we kind of see that here in the United States as well. But in terms of, what does it mean for solidarity in sort of global ways? Well, it's, linking to African diaspora and countries in Africa in the 1960s wasn't linking you to the most powerful countries in the world, right? It was an attempt for solidarity, but predominantly white America didn't accept it, right? Predominantly white Holland didn't accept it, Australia, et cetera. And so, if we think about sort of the effectiveness of a political strategy in linking with other marginalized groups, that's great, you get the solidarity, but it didn't lead to anything significant politically for West Papuans. I'm not sure if I'm going exactly where you want me to go with answering this question, or
We can talk about it later.
okay. All right. It's there are Papuans who are optimistic about this and who see this as a way of expressing themselves and linking themselves to broader movements, right? Especially in the United States and elsewhere. But whether or not they'll be effective remains to be seen. And so far, I think in the big picture in Indonesia, it's not. It's not. As I mentioned, with the recent subdivision of the province into more provinces, they're not listening to West Papuans. I'm not sure if I answered. I don't think I did. But
We have a few questions online.
Sure.
First question was, thank you for excellent talk. Can you add any more insight comparing the Timor Leste case with West Papua on any angle, racism, colonialism, independence, etc.?
Sure. So as some background, I worked with the East Timor Action Network here in the United States since 1994. I'm on their executive committee. I still work with them. I write and I publish about Timor-Leste. I was in Timor-Leste in 1999 as a United Nations observer for the referendum. So one of the things that's different is that Timor-Leste was smaller and more united. It was also predominantly Catholic, which helped. And Indonesia's invasion was never formalized through a referendum, even though in Papua in 1969 it was a sham. There's no question about it. It was a fake referendum. Timor-Leste never had that. In Timor-Leste, they killed around between 1/4 and 1/3 of the population in about 5 years, and so this was a tremendous. Indonesia had genocidal policies, and this was filmed in 1991, a massacre of over 400 people, right? And so there were images that went around the world, and there was a solidarity movement that emerged in 1991, 1992, including in the United States. It was an easier, cleaner conflict to portray. West Papua is much more complicated, partly because West Papua is so big and so diverse that Tay's Eloe was the leader who emerged, who sort of united people, but the Indonesians recognized that and they took him out. They assassinated him, right? And nobody emerged to take his place. So even within West Papua, there are different organizations and groups that have different goals and different strategies. And so it's not as united as Timor-Leste was, right? And if we think about the racial element of this, Timorese are not as dark skinned, right? And the elite was Portuguese or Portugal oriented. They spoke Portuguese and they had connections. They had spokespeople on their behalf in people such as the Catholic Bishop Bello and Da Costa Lopez, right? And so they had these sort of institutional ties and could be portrayed in the West as sort of Portugal oriented. Papuans don't have that. And even in the West, in the United States, right, they're still portrayed as these sort of naked savages. And so I think that racism, however, under the surface or above the surface, still colors people's perceptions of whether or not West Papuans are actually able to govern themselves and effectively lead themselves. In Timor-Leste, people said the country's going to be poor and will be a disaster when it becomes independent. It's the most democratic state in Southeast Asia by many measures and has been very successful. It's about to run out of oil and it's about to become much poorer, but it's done very well so far, right? And people, I think, don't have these expectations for West Papuans, even though similarly, West Papua still has the resources to become a very rich region on its own if it was able to manage and control its own resources.
We still have a couple more questions.
Okay.
I know we're at the time, but there's one more question that I would like to ask as well that is posted here.
Okay.
It's by Professor Abraham. So we can see these kind of racism and exploitation in other Asia countries like India, Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam. But can you reflect on these cross-national similarities? And do the Papuans see they apply as similar to or identify with the oppressive conditions faced by other ethnic minorities in the majoritarian Asia?
No, I can't. No, that's I don't mean to be pithy, but I'm not an expert in racial minorities throughout Southeast Asia in places like Vietnam or elsewhere. But I think from what I see in West Papua, it is linking to the global Black movement. That's the most important thing for them. And the discrimination towards minorities in other places, especially, for example, religious minorities in India today, it's problematic, but they aren't necessarily the same in terms of historical experience, right? I'm just drawing attention to West Papua. I mean, we could talk for days about everywhere else. So I think that's probably an unsatisfactory answer, but I'm not really willing to go further. Racism bad, right? I mean, everybody knows that, but.
The other question is, why do you think some Indonesian people claim to be in post-colonial time? And how is that similar to those in America who don't see the country continuing colonization when the indigenous community, for example, voices the destruction of their communities because of imperialism?
One of the distinctions we have to draw here is territorial, right? West Papua it's distinct territory in Indonesia, right? And if we talk about the Black experience in the United States, we can talk about regional demographics that are different, but at the same time, we have a Black population in the United States, this in every state and dispersed, et cetera, right? So that's an important factor to take into consideration. I'm sorry, can you repeat the first part again?
Yes. Why do you think some Indonesian people claim to be in post-colonial time?
Well, Indonesia is a post-colonial society in that it gained its independence from the Dutch, right? The justification that some Indonesians make and say, well, I can't be racist because post-colonial, I have African-American friends who have told me, well, I'm African-American, I can't be racist. But that's not true, right? If we look at, for example, the targeting of Korean stores in LA during the Rodney King riots, et cetera, right? So there's this promotion by some people, I guess, that if you are part of an ethnic minority, you therefore can't be racist, which is absolutely not true. And in the Indonesian case, they view themselves, and Indonesia has a proud history, and I'm not criticizing all of Indonesian history or putting down all of Indonesia, right? It's got a very proud history and a successful revolution against the Dutch, but that does not mean that there can't be racism directed towards West Papuans by Indonesians, even though some claim that, right? And I mentioned in my paper, this idea that, well, we're sending them development funds, so we're not racist. Like that doesn't make any sense. And so, I think there's, as my paper talks about, there's a refusal on the part of many Indonesians to acknowledge the fact that this is a problem. And if you can't acknowledge that it's a problem, it's never going to get solved.
There's one more. I noticed there's a hand up.
Oh, that's the question that I asked.
Oh, okay. We have kept our speaker over time. Are there any more? This is such a, yes, we'll go over.
Sure.
I'm another Indonesian in this room. Okay. Yeah, it's
Uh-oh.
very interesting to hear about your opinion about Indonesia. Yeah. And maybe some of the point of your presentation, we can discuss it in Indonesia, especially in this government institution like in university like this. And in Indonesia, I think the conversation about is always about the foreign intervention. Especially when you talk about maybe about the Freeport company in Indonesia, so we talk about American intervention as well in Papua, in West Papua. And don't you think, my question is, don't you think there is another, you talk about the internal imperialism in Indonesia right now. Don't you think that there is another, let's say, smaller version of internal imperialism happening in Papua right now, like especially when the recent corruption case done by the Lucas NMB, the Papuan governor. So don't you think that the ruling elites in Papua themselves, they try to oppress their own people there? So we should be fair to see this.
It's absolutely true. And individuals have their own motivations for their own behavior. There have always been Indonesia-oriented elites in West Papua going back to the revolution. I don't want to say that West Papuans who support a referendum or independence is everybody, right? Part of this has to do with the fact that, Boven in West Papua is where the Dutch sent Indonesian nationalists, and they conversed with West Papuans and convinced them of their cause, right? But in more recent years, there have always been elites geared towards Indonesia and will remain that way. They become the governors, they become the chief bureaucrats, et cetera. But of course, they have their own motivations, and sometimes that motivation is corrupt. And so they will steal from their own people, right? As I mentioned, Tez Elaway was a Golkar cadre, was a Golkar politician who then, after 1999, turned against Indonesia. In the same way that in the 1960s, Papuans who supported Indonesia saw what it meant to be part of Indonesia and then reversed course and decided not to. So, it's one of the sticky things about West Papua, again, in comparison to Timor-Leste, is that there is such a wide variety of opinion, although I think a lot of people do support self-determination and referendum, but you get people who the Indonesians can hold up and say, look at our governor, he's ethnically West Papuan and he supports Indonesia all the way, right? The Indonesian governor of West Papua was one of the first people to criticize the pemekaran, or the division of West Papua into further provinces as well. So it's not 100% loyalty, right? So even loyalist Indonesian West Papuans aren't 100% with Indonesian policy all the time. So, you know, it's again, it's such a diverse place and such a spread apart place that you know, it's one of the reasons why I think the resistance to Indonesia hasn't been better organized. But it also means, like I said, you get people who support Indonesia. And then talking about imperialism, yeah, I mean, it's, you know, Indonesia wants the resources but doesn't want to deal with the political mess. But right now, they're making enough money to make it worthwhile. Right? There might be a calculation at some point that says we don't want this. I wanted to mention, talking about political representation, we see this as well in the United States with this notion of tokenism among the African American community, right? Where you know, certain African Americans are held up. I had a conversation with somebody in Mexico about, she leans to the right in the United States, about poverty among African Americans in the United States. I said, you know, disproportionate levels of poverty among African Americans, disproportionate levels of imprisonment, et cetera. And she said, yes, but there are rich Blacks in the United States. I said, yes, of course there are. I'm not talking about one or two token examples. You know, we're talking about, you know, on average, as a proportion, Blacks are poorer in the United States. And the same thing can be said for West Papua, right? They're poorer, but you do have a few elites.
Well, it looks like we're actually kept our speaker past time. Again, thank you very much. This was just fascinating, really engaging, and connects in so many ways, not only to the theme of our series, but you know, to research going on all across the university. So thanks everybody very much for coming. Thanks to everybody for coming via the Zoom. If you'd like to stick around, Sean has ordered an incredible array of things. They all actually have to be eaten before we can unlock the doors.
That's what
So please
nobody leaves till the food is gone.
grab a sandwich. If Dr. Lundry doesn't mind, we can continue the conversation. But again, thank you very much for a wonderful talk.
For acknowledging the issue as a whole, I especially appreciated what you